This is Chris Gray. Gray, jumper, he scores! Now Campbell, that's a 2, he scores! The rookie ties it at 13!
It was a Michael Sowers thing. We just, we kind of go as he goes, and, we're better off when the ball's in his stick and he's being aggressive and putting pressure on the defense.
All right, what's up, guys? Welcome into Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. That first bit of audio that you heard to open the show was the call of the Chris Gray goal as the Atlas got the win late in the game on Saturday afternoon over the Whipsnakes. The first time ever that the Atlas have defeated the Whipsnakes in PLL history. So for me as an Atlas fan, that was a really exciting and entertaining game to watch and see that goal happen live. I think I even said this on Saturday after the game. I don't think I've actually screamed that loud in such a long time. And then watching that ensuing face-off in those final 18 or so seconds just ticking down was really nerve-wracking, because it looked like for a minute there the Whipsnakes might be able to come up with that ground ball and make one final push to try and tie the game back up. But the Atlas ended up getting the job done. That second clip of audio was the Matt Campbell two-pointer, again late in the game type of situation similar to the Chris Gray goal, but the Matt Campbell goal that tied the game at 13 and would later send the game into overtime. Obviously the Cannons fell in overtime to the Chaos in that game, but that Campbell goal was significant not just because it tied the game at 13 and eventually sent it into overtime, as I stated, but also if you remember back to Thursday's episode and when we went over the picks, I had mentioned Matt Campbell was a pick that I liked over 1.5 points in that game, and that two-pointer put him at 3 for the day. So that was a pretty significant two-ball from Matt Campbell in both regards. And then that final clip of audio was Water Dogs head coach Andy Copeland talking about the impact that Michael Sowers really carries for that offense, stating pretty simply, we kind of go as he goes, and you saw sort of the impact that his absence in a way had in week 1 for that offense, and then coming back in a big way here this weekend, even in a loss to the Redwoods on Friday night, still came up pretty big for them. That's why I also took him in Thursday's episode in fantasy. He was only a 9-point cap hit for PLL fantasy. So I said, hey, when you have a chance to go out and get a guy like Michael Sowers for that low of a cap hit, you got to do it, and just understand that there's a good chance he's not going to be absent from that offense 2 weekends in a row. And again, like I said, he showed up in a big way on Friday night. So what I want to do with this episode is pretty simple. I want to get your comments and your thoughts from week 2 in the PLL here on this episode. Just kind of go through what you guys had to say. I'll give you my thoughts on that. So just to jump right in to this episode, on Twitter, Coach Shrek says, the Atlas finally get over the hump and get their first win over the Whipsnakes. Could this loss mean that the Whipsnakes might not make the playoffs this year? Brett Dobson is the real deal. Expect him to win a PLL MVP at some point in his PLL career. And lastly, no lead is safe. Yeah, and I agree with all those points. Like I said in the open, finally getting to see, as an Atlas fan, see the Atlas beat the Whipsnakes for the first time ever. I was there in Baltimore in 2021. I believe that was Jeff Teet's first PLL game as a rookie. I was there in Baltimore for that Friday night game between the Atlas and the Whipsnakes, and to see that game go into overtime and really feeling throughout the entirety of that game that the Atlas were right there toe-to-toe with the Whipsnakes when the Whipsnakes were who they were, and they had that championship pedigree going on, to see that live and to feel like they were so close and just couldn't make that final play in overtime. And I believe it was Matt Rambo, of course, that got the game-winning goal. But to see that live and then to see them win on Saturday, sitting on my couch watching at home, was just a really good feeling as an Atlas fan. He says, could this loss mean that the Whipsnakes might not make the playoffs? I think starting 0-2 on the year, and that's another comment that I think somebody a little bit later on this episode brings up, but I think starting 0-2 on the year does definitely dig yourself in a hole. Now, score differential obviously does play a factor into that as well. Their score differential doesn't look bad, at least through the first 2 weekends, but yes, I'd definitely say week 3 is a must-win game, because as much as you can't start the year 0-2, you really can't start the year 0-3. If they do start the year 0-3, then I think we start to have that conversation of maybe the Whipsnakes are bizarrely the team left out. I mean, what kind of alternate universe would we be living in that the Whipsnakes don't even make the postseason? But again, like I said, it's only been 2 weeks. There's still a lot of season left to be played. And again, score differential does matter. So if they do pick up a couple wins here in the next few weeks, and they do it pretty convincingly, that really changes the trajectory of their season pretty quickly. He says, Brett Dobson is the real deal. Expect him to win a PLL MVP at some point in his career. Yeah, he's been fantastic through the first 2 weeks. He leads the league in total saves and save percentage. He's a big reason why the Archers are 2-0 and atop the PLL standing. So yeah, he's been absolutely fantastic to start the year. But again, just like I've been saying these first 2 episodes that I've done here in this 2023 season, it's a long season. We got to see how some of these players progress throughout the year. He asked last week about Sisselberger and the performance he put up in week 1, and I said straight up, I don't know if that's necessarily sustainable week in and week out. You have to see how he plays out the rest of the way, and of course guys are going to make adjustments to whatever it is that he's doing that's made him so successful to start the year. So as the season kind of goes along, you'll get a bigger picture of what some of these newer guys can do. But so far, yeah, guys like Sisselberger and Brett Dobson have been absolutely phenomenal through the first 2 weeks that we've gotten to see them on a more regular basis as starters. And he says, lastly, no lead is safe. Yeah, I mean, we saw that on Friday night. Water Dogs go up very early in the first quarter, 6-0, and you're thinking, man, they might put a 20 piece on them tonight. And then all of a sudden, over the next 15-20 minutes or so, you turn around and all of a sudden it's 6-5, and of course the game ends up being 10-9. And so yeah, I mean, absolutely no. And you've seen it too, where he says no lead is safe. You've seen it too, where in the first 2 weeks, I think something like 5 or 6 of the first 8 games have been 1-goal games, and 2 of those have gone to overtime. So yeah, absolutely, there's a ton of parity in the league this season, and just so many games have been such nail biters, going down to really the last play or 2 of the game. And like I said, even 2 of them going into overtime. So yeah, just a lot of really exciting play so far through the first 2 weeks. For Michael Ramirez, he says, I'm happy with the Atlas finally getting a win over the Whipsnakes, and even more important, don't start the year out 0-2, And going back to Coach Schreck's comment, that's something that I said, is it's very important to not start the year out 0-2, or even worse, possibly in the case of the Whipsnakes, 0-3, just looking ahead to next week. But anyway, he says, Byrne hasn't cooled off since the final game of the NLL Championship. Dobbs was an absolute brick wall for the Archers, and the Woods showed toughness in their comeback win. So yeah, kind of playing off Coach Schreck here with some of his comments. Yes, like I said, happy the Atlas got the win. And I think even if you're a Whipsnakes fan, you might, the loss might sting, but I mean, you do have to admit that was a pretty amazing game. That was a pretty amazing finish to that game. I really did think that game was going to go to overtime, but then Chris Gray obviously had other ideas. So I think that at least as a lacrosse fan, putting your fandom aside, I think you can at least agree that that was a pretty epic game and a pretty epic finish to that game. He says, Byrne hasn't cooled off since the final game of the NLL Championship. Yeah, and I even heard a comment in his post-game press conference where Andy Towers pretty openly said, I think he's the best left-handed attackman in the world, and even kind of backpedaled and said, well, he actually you could make the argument that he's the best attackman in the world. And I think with somebody like Lyle Thompson sitting out the PLL season this summer, he could actually make that case for, yes, being the best, if not one of the best attackmen in the world currently. And that's not just exclusive to the outdoor game. He says Dobbs was an absolute brick wall for the Archers, and the Woods showed toughness in their comeback win. Yeah, like I said to Shrek's point about no lead being safe, you were down 6-0 very quickly in that game on Friday night. And like I said, I really thought that game was going to get even more so out of hand as the game went along, but they really just took it seemed like one play at a time, and just kept chipping away at that Water Dogs lead. And then you kind of saw there at the very end of the game, the face of Water Dogs head coach Andy Copeland just almost like a blank stare on his face from the sideline, almost like what just happened. And I think that was a lot of us watching that game. They were fully in command of that game through the first, I don't know, 8 to 10 or so minutes of that game. And then to see how it ended up, you almost kind of sat there scratching your head a bit. From Brendan on the Atlas fan group page on the PLL Discord, he says Curry is great at the invert, which is crucial since we lost Baccaro and Crawley, who were both great at that. I would like to see more from O'Rourke, and I'm wondering if the addition of Rafis increases the offensive efficiency or if it hinders Curry's newfound confidence. I think I need to see more from Makar, but Adler is phenomenal. So there's a couple things here that Brendan gets into, and he starts out by saying Curry is great at the invert, which is crucial since they lost Baccaro and Crawley. Yeah, like he said, that's something that was kind of their role within the offense the last couple of years, was they would get that short stick matchup, they would invert to X and try to attack that matchup one-on-one and kind of see how the defense played that. So now I think it looks like, from what Brendan's saying, and I would tend to agree, is that it kind of looks like Curry now slides into that role for Stephen Brooks, the offensive coordinator for the Atlas. And on Saturday, he did an excellent job of it. He scored 3 goals in the game, largely doing just that, just taking his matchup to X and just using his speed and athleticism to win that matchup one-on-one. So if that can be his role going forward, I think that really opens things up for that Atlas offense, and especially from the midfield, what guys like Costabile, Romar, Dennis, and others can be able to do. He says, I'd like to see more from O'Rourke, and I'm wondering if the addition of Rafis increases the offensive efficiency. Yeah, I would also agree with that. I'd like to see them get more touches for Mark O'Rourke going forward, kind of see what he can do with the ball on his cross. And I thought about this the other day, if that means maybe giving a game or two off for Romar Dennis, I would actually be okay with that from a fan's standpoint, just to be able to kind of see what he can do, and maybe even giving a guy like Stephen Rafis a chance to enter the lineup as well. Because like he says, would those two getting more touches and getting more opportunities to be in the lineup from the midfield, would that increase their efficiency? Because I like Romar Dennis. I think he's an excellent player. He's obviously a physical specimen at 6'5" and about 230, and he definitely can shoot the 2-ball, but if all you're essentially getting from him is somebody that every 2-3 games probably can hit a 2, and that's really about it. I mean, he hit one on Saturday against the Whipsnakes. If that's really essentially the bulk of what he gives you, and is maybe a decent defender from the midfield on the other side of things, if that's really what he gives you, I don't have a problem with them inserting O'Rourke and even Rafis into the lineup a couple times here and there, just to kind of see what the offense is with them in the lineup, how they play with guys like Curry, how they play with Costabile, how they work moving the ball to the attack and things like that. So yeah, I wouldn't be against that at all. And he says, I think I need to see more from Makar, but Adler's phenomenal. So here's my thing with Makar, is he's got 1 caused turnover and 9 ground balls through his first 2 professional games. And I think while a lot of the attention was paid to the job that Adler did in the second half of that game against the Whipsnakes, holding Zed Williams 0 for 6 shooting once they switched him onto that matchup, I think as much attention as is being paid to Adler right now, Makar hasn't been playing poorly. It's just one of those things where, and they even talked about this week 1 when the Atlas took on the Redwoods, they mentioned we haven't really called Makar's name a whole lot in this game, and I believe, don't hold me to this, but I think it was Ryan Boyle that said, well, sometimes when you're a defender, not having your name called is actually not a bad thing, because it means that you're doing your job and holding down your matchup well enough that we're not just showing highlights of you getting burned over and over again. So and I think you have to go back to even his college days at Maryland too for Makar, is that he was used to being sort of the guy defensively for them and covering the opposing team's number 1 attackman. I don't necessarily think that's something he's being asked to do right now for the Atlas. It seems like Tucker Durkin, it largely is getting that number 1 matchup, and then whether it's Rexroad or Adler is getting that number 2 matchup, and you saw that on Saturday in the Whipsnakes game. Durkin was on Rambo, and whether it was Rexroad or Adler, they were on Zed Williams, and then I would imagine Makar was on whoever the third attackman was in that situation. So he's going from in college where he was the guy and you saw him all over the field making plays to now just having to sort of play his position, play his role within that Atlas defense, and he's doing it well. So just because he's not jumping off the screen at you when you're watching on ABC or ESPN Plus, whatever the case may be, doesn't mean that he's necessarily underperforming, even relative to where he got drafted, because I see that getting thrown around a lot too, is that you took these guys number 1 and 3, but was he worth taking with the number 3 pick? And I've said it before, there was a reason you took those guys both in the top 5, because you expected them to play right away. You expected them to make an impact right away. And I think so far through their first 2 games, again, very small sample size, but I think through their first 2 games, they're doing just that. Like, they're doing the job that you brought them in to do. From Angus on PLL Discord, from the PLL Fantasy group, now kind of diving a little more into PLL Fantasy. This is something that I wanted to at least touch on with this episode. He said, I'd say overall that fantasy is good, and the weekly salary function that depends on how players perform requires you to pick different players each week. And yeah, I think that's something that even going back to Thursday's episode, you kind of look at it, you have to see sort of where some of these guys fall. I mean, Michael Sowers, because of a poor week 1 performance, was only 9 points towards your salary cap. So like I said, when you have an opportunity to go get a player like that for practically nothing, you kind of just do it and don't ask a whole lot of questions, and then you kind of piece some things together around that. So that's how I ended up with him and Jeff Teed as my 2 attackmen last week in PLL Fantasy. So yeah, and I would definitely say, I think I mentioned this on Thursday's episode, when you go back to last season's PLL Fantasy and you had the tiers that you worked with 1, 2, and 3, and you picked certain guys based on tiers, you kind of get that same vibe with it from the salary cap concept, where it's like you've got guys that are in that, 50 to 40 or 50 to 35 point range. Then you get the guys that are kind of like the 35 to 20 range, and then you get the guys that are 20 and below. So it's still kind of a tiered concept, I guess, when you really think about it. But I think just the salary cap version of that, I would say it kind of hits different. And I think, like one of these comments says, is it kind of allows you a little more flexibility with how you value certain positions or how you value certain players. So I think once you kind of figure out the strategy that works for you, then you kind of just go from there and build out your lineup that way. But yeah, I'd say overall it's been pretty solid. And it's only year 2 or year 3 of this, so it's not going to be perfect to this point. I still think that there's room to grow, of course, and the PLL is one where they'll try things like this, and then they'll get as much feedback from users as they can, and then kind of build off what works and try to shape it into something that users really want, or something that they want to see more of. From Big Andy, again on PLL Discord, he says, I think fantasy is in a good spot, but with some changes, it could be in a great spot, and I still do wish ESPN picked it up and gave us the more standard option, however. And yeah, kind of going back to Angus's point before, like I said, I think it's in a good spot, like Andy says. But again, with some tweaking, and again, this is still a pretty new concept for the PLL doing fantasy lacrosse, but with a little more tweaking, I definitely think, like Andy says, it can be in a great spot. And I do think that in time it will get there, and we just have to allow it to kind of organically grow. And he says, I do wish ESPN picked it up and gave us more standard options. And again, I would agree with that. I do think that in time it could get there, especially with their partnership now with ESPN. I mean, you're seeing them all over ESPN platforms, whether it's ABC, ESPN Plus, whatever the case may be in terms of streaming. But you're also seeing now ESPN doing more with showing highlights on things like SportsCenter. They're posting a lot more highlights on their social media pages. So I think through that partnership with ESPN, I do think that at some point in time you could see ESPN PLL Fantasy. And I would be 100% on board if it ever got to that point. But I have no problem with the PLL kind of handling it in-house, because I trust that they'll do the right things to continue to grow it, to develop it, and make it better moving forward. From Jesse Bruning on Twitter, now kind of going back to just the more getting your general thoughts in the mix on the PLL. He says, here's to hoping that streaming these games after the broadcast is enough to support the league. Year after year, the kids and parents that want to be the biggest fans of this sport have already booked their weekends traveling to club tournaments. So he's talking more streaming, such as on ESPN Plus, or we've even seen a couple games here in the first 2 weeks on ABC. But of course, you can go back and watch all the PLL games archived on ESPN Plus. So he's talking about hoping that being able to go back and watch the games archived on ESPN Plus is enough to support the league going forward, as more and more people, it seems like, are participating in summer youth lacrosse programs and in tournaments and things like that take up a good bulk of their weekend. And I know for me personally, as a youth lacrosse coach here in Southeast Michigan, during the first day of PLL games, the other weekend on Saturday, I had an all-day event that I was coaching with my lacrosse club, so I wasn't able to watch either of the first 2 games of the regular season live. I had to go back after I got home that night and watch them on ESPN Plus, which is what Jesse's talking about here. And I would say to his point, or to his concern rather, I understand it, but I don't think it's as big of an issue as you might be concerned with, because I think that for people like me that are big supporters of the league, or just big supporters and big fans of lacrosse in general, you're going to watch. Doesn't matter if it's live or if it's on replay on ESPN Plus, like, you're going to watch. You're going to take the time to watch those games, even if you're fast forwarding through commercials and things like that. You're going to watch no matter what, because you're so invested into the league and you're so invested into the sport itself that you want to watch it however and whenever you have the ability to do so. And I mean, the other thing too is, there was dozens, and I mean dozens, of programs represented at this event that I was at that first day of the PLL games, which means they were in the same position as I was. They couldn't be at home watching the games on TV like I wasn't able to, and I'm sure that many of them did what I did and went home that night, or maybe even the next day, and watched the games on replay. But I'd say even still, now imagine that's going on across the country, not just here in Michigan, but across the country, and especially on the East Coast and things like that, where lacrosse is in more of those hotbed areas. Imagine that that's going on across the country, and in that very same day, that very first game on ABC, the Redwoods and Atlas game, was the most watched PLL game in the history of the league. So that's where I'm kind of sitting here thinking, okay, I get Jesse's point. It's definitely something that I think the league needs to be aware of, and I'm sure they are aware of that, but it doesn't seem like it's really slowed down their viewership or even their interactions on social media. I mean, you see it at the end of every season or heading into each new season. They always post their numbers from the previous season and say, hey, our viewership on ESPN platforms was up this percentage year over year. Our engagements on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok and all these different platforms was up so many percentage points year over year, and their numbers have gone through the roof since they've been on ESPN, whether it be on their streaming platforms or whether it's on social media. So again, I get his concern, but I'm not so sure that it really is a concern, because what you have to realize is that the demographic that he's referring to, which is primarily high school age lacrosse players and younger, is the demographic that the PLL mostly is trying to target to. So if they felt like these tournaments and different things that go on in the summer had any sort of impact, or really anything, not even just these summer events, but really anything was impacting their ability to reach that audience, whether it be on social media or whether it be streaming on ESPN Plus and those types of things, they would make those kinds of adjustments. But like I said, because we're seeing that growth in interactions on social media, because we're seeing that growth in viewership in streaming of games year over year, they're not seeing that it's really that big of an issue. Could it be an issue down the line as these youth events become bigger and more prominent and get more drawn out as these summers go along? It could be, but I definitely think that's a problem for maybe 5 to 10 years from now. I'm not sure that it's necessarily an immediate concern, but like I said, I understand it, but I also think that when you really look deeper into the issue, it's really not much of a concern at all, because like I said, they're showing that the results are there. So that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this post. You can also find the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, including Google, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Stitcher, just to name a few. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.